have to assume that. We have no reason not to think that. In the Cambrian, we can see animals that are just like modern arthropods in their body plan, just like modern vertebrates, just like modern mollusks, various kinds of worms, echinoderms, which include the starfish. When we watch them develop today, we have no reason to think that similar animals in the Cambrian didn't develop the same way. And that's why the Cambrian fossils are recognizable in most cases as members of modern animal phyla. So the complexity is already there, full-blown, right from the start. And if the complexity is there, then the complexity of development is also there, because presumably these animals all developed from a single fertilized egg. And so the processes we see now, we can, I think, legitimately extrapolate back to the Cambrian. Before the Cambrian, whatever forms of animal life we had were far simpler than what we have in the Cambrian. So the genetic materials to support the diversity of life in the Cambrian had to appear rather suddenly. It was an explosion of genetic information, very real, and I think inexplicable on Darwinian terms. But there was also an explosion of information of another sort, and that's the information that gets us body plans. The body plan, as far as we know, is not in the DNA. For example, we know a lot of genes that play roles in development that are very similar in fruit flies and humans. And yet fruit flies and humans have totally different body plans. It turns out that those genes, the most impressive ones, the most dramatic ones, are active fairly late in embryo development, long after the body plan is established. So whatever is establishing the body plan, it's something else. And there obviously had to be an explosion of body plans as well as an explosion of DNA information. Certainly DNA is essential. You cannot get an animal without the proper DNA. But developmental biologists know that there's a lot more to development than the DNA. We sometimes hear the notion of a genetic program where the DNA is the blueprint for the organism. That's quite a common image, but in fact, we know that there's a lot of information for development that's not in the DNA. So properly speaking, the DNA is not the blueprint. It's more like a parts list. The DNA provides the body, the animal body, with proteins and RNAs and other chemical constituents, but the DNA does not dictate the form of the animal, as far as we know. Well, a house is another good analogy for the way DNA functions in the cell. The DNA, as I said, is like a parts list. Well, I could create 10 different piles of building materials, all of them identical, all of them with, lots of lumber and piping and wiring and nails and roofing and cement and so on. Same thing in each pile, and give each pile to a different person and send them off where they can't see each other and say, okay, build me a house. And the odds that any two of those houses would look the same are very slim. Because with the same materials, you can build all kinds of structures. And it's the same with the cell. The DNA provides the building materials, or the list of building materials, but then the cell decides the floor plan. The floor plan is somewhere else, because to build a house, you just can't have building materials. You need actually assembly instructions. You have to do things in a certain order. If you build the roof first, you're in big trouble. You have to put the foundation in, the walls, the piping, the wiring. You need a certain sequence here. And you need a floor plan to know how to lay out the floor and the walls to begin with, where to put the windows. And the DNA gives us the list of parts, but the rest, for the most part, certainly the floor plan is somewhere else. We've known all along that most mutations are either harmful or neutral. Neutral meaning they don't have any noticeable effect, at least not right away. But really beneficial mutations, which would be the only kind evolution could use anyway, are extremely rare. Furthermore, They are biochemical in nature. For example, in antibiotic resistance, we know mutations can lead to antibiotic resistance, and then those bacteria can survive in the presence of, say, streptomycin, where others could not. But the bacteria that survive are still the same species of bacteria, still tuberculosis, for example. So even the rare beneficial mutations we find do not really transform the organism. They make minor changes within existing species, which have never been controversial. And of course, the evidence for mutations has already suggested that to us. I can take a fruit fly embryo, and this has been done, in fact, and it can be mutated in every possible way, the DNA. And there are only 3 possible outcomes: a normal fruit fly, a defective fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly. That's it. You can't even change the species, much less get a horsefly or a horse or something like that. Well, we've certainly found a lot of evidence, but for what? Darwin's theory is that all living things are descended from a common ancestor, modified by unguided natural processes such as natural selection and variation. Darwin didn't write a book called How Existing Species Change Over Time. That's not even relevant. People have known that for centuries. So minor changes within existing species are not the issue here. And yet when Darwinists say there's overwhelming evidence for Darwin's theory, 90% of what they talk about is minor changes within existing species. That's not the point at all. The point is the origin of new species by this same process. And no one has ever observed the origin of a new species through variation and selection. And they've tried. They've tried many times. But that key element in Darwin's theory, the origin of a new species, the title of his book, has never been solved. Now, the common ancestry part, the argument for that is usually based on similarities and differences. You know, I look, you know, I have certain similarities to this animal or that animal, and certain dissimilarities which show this or that. Well, those arguments are interesting, but they're not conclusive, because you can argue the same way on the basis of common design. You know, I look like this and not like that because there's a design reason for that. You can do the same with cars. In fact, Darwinists have used car models as an illustration of descent with modification, but cars are designed, they're created by engineers. So until you get this one important step where one species can originate from another species, why should I accept common ancestry at all? Because the mechanism is not there. The similarities and differences can cut either way. But what we're totally lacking at this point is good evidence for Darwin's basic mechanism.